Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today, brought to you by StorageCraft. Before we get started, I do want to remind you about a few features on our console. This webinar is being recorded, so if you step away or miss any portion of today's session, you can view the webinar on demand using the link that will be sent to you in about a day. Also, this webinar is interactive. You can get your questions in by using the Q&A widget on your screen, and that's located right under the slides. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and if we do miss a question, we will follow up with you after today. Also want to remind you that we have some handouts available in the handout section, so look there for that. And also, we do have an attendee chat, so dive in and start a conversation with your fellow IT pros. With any of these features on your screen, you can take them to minimize or maximize using the functions on the bottom of your screen on the orange icon buttons. So let's get started. We've got a great session lined up, and we also have a live demo, so stay tuned for that. So introducing our speaker, Sean Darrington, Senior Director of Product Management at StorageCraft, and he comes with over 20 years of storage experience. So Sean, with that, I'll hand it to you to get started.
Great, thanks David, and good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're dialing in from. It's great to have everybody here today. As David said, I'm Senior Director of Product Management here, and actually been working with the Spiceworks team since the days at Exablocks, and a couple of years ago, StorageCraft acquired Exablocks, and we now have some exciting things that we are delivering in terms of combining the best of both worlds, if you will, in terms of scale-out storage with data protection. So it really affords everybody here on the call an opportunity to recover their information in ways that previously has not been possible. So I wanted to kind of set the stage with a little bit of background, and then we'll dive into how we're solving that, and certainly spend as much time doing a live demonstration with one system, as you'll see here, in terms of how you can protect applications and recover them. So with that, let me jump into a little bit of setting the stage, right? I think everybody on the call can relate to some of the challenges you have here, and maybe it's not all of your challenges that you're seeing. Well, certainly not all of your challenges, but maybe a couple of these resonate with you in terms of the ability to manage unstructured data growth. That's one of the things that oftentimes is the most unwieldy because it's the least predictable. Sometimes with databases, you have a little bit more of a predictable run rate in terms of the capacity that's going to be consumed by that database, as opposed to users just creating more files, or if you're using medical imaging, you're transitioning to higher res 3D mammography as an example. But in all those cases, it's all about managing storage and spending as little time as possible managing storage and mitigating and ideally eliminating forklift upgrades when you're transitioning hardware at the end of that life cycle, or if you're trying to predict your 3-year growth, you don't get it quite right, that can cause a lot of pain for you as an IT administrator. At the same time, the cost of downtime to your business is increasing, and so trying to minimize that and get back up and running from different types of failures and different recovery scenarios is certainly a priority for most of the administrators that we speak with. The other thing is in terms of just threat protection, right? And that's really where I'm going to focus most of the conversation today, is around how do you mitigate threat protection for malicious ransomware, cryptography, URL invasions, etc. So really wanted to focus a little bit on the pain point about where a lot of the conversations with the customers that I'm having is that cybercrime really is a business, right? It used to be, it used to be mostly for notoriety, where an organization would potentially be targeted by an individual. At the same time, this has actually turned into more of a business, and we've gone beyond the individual attacker, right? Targeting oftentimes consumers. This is actually morphed into more of an attack on businesses, where with ransomware in particular, this is one of the things that unfortunately a number of our customers have been infected with, particularly in medical and the healthcare industry, based upon that. And we're seeing for the change in not only the attack vectors, but also just the prevalence in terms of the number of variants of ransomware is increasing year over year. This is actually from a SonicWall 2018 cyber threat report, where you can see the unique ransomware signatures increasing year over year. And we don't see that actually, or nor do we expect that to decrease. The threat vectors and the attack vectors for ransomware may change in terms of how the payload is delivered. However, the variance and the complexity is certainly there. And we've seen this with the ransomware the last couple of years, where it's actually morphed to be able to either disable Windows BSS snapshots or disable them while it looks like it's actually enabled, and even delete some BSS snapshots. So there are some things that that are changing in terms of how you, as administrators, need to manage that threat protection. At the same time, phishing attacks and URL is one of those other ways that payloads can be delivered. And with many of you having end users with like a bring your own device model, bringing their consumer handheld laptop, iPad, smartphone, etc., those high-risk URLs can infiltrate not only the potential company property and on the company network and the corporate network, but oftentimes the consumers themselves are infiltrated and infected with multiple variants of malware that can then make its way onto the corporate network, even though the initial ingest and the initial threat vector was actually on a consumer network and a consumer device. So just wanted to highlight this from the WebRoot threat report this year in terms of the number of phishing attacks and URLs being across the top 10 countries that you see here. This is something that all of us are dealing with. And one of the things I wanted to ask everybody here on the webinar today, to be a little honest. We're not going to use this in terms of, we're not going to publish your name, and you don't have to be embarrassed if you actually have been infected with ransomware. But I want to ask, for your organization, have you been infected with ransomware? There are a couple of options here, and you can choose two. No, I have not. I know I haven't, but another colleague has. And you can see the other options there, including yes, but I'll never admit it, which is oftentimes or can be the case. And then those that like bacon, you can obviously choose that one as well. But give everybody just a moment here to reply, and then I'll post the results of this. So seeing a good mix here. Actually, a good number of people actually have not been infected, which is fantastic. The threat vectors of firewall, antivirus, perimeter detection, intrusion detection, that's obviously your first line of defense, and it sounds like that's actually working for a good portion of the attendees here. And those that have been infected, we've got about half there that actually have or know somebody else. So it looks like it's kind of settled down here. I'm going to go ahead and share the results with everybody else. So you can see about half have not, as I was referring to earlier, but a lot of you on the call know others that have been infected, which hopefully they were able to get their information back. And about 40% of you like bacon, which is fantastic. All right, so let me transition now and share a little bit about where StorageCraft is headed with your ability to recover information. We've been spending a lot of time over the years, certainly advancing our scale-out storage capabilities with OneBlock. We recently renamed and rebranded that to be OneXafe because we actually included what StorageCraft has been doing for years, and that is the data protection software for physical as well as virtual servers. We've now combined those capabilities of both storage and data protection into a converged solution. So now as you have a OneXafe cluster, those data protection services are actually running on the cluster hardware itself. And so those data protection services are communicating with both physical and virtual servers in ways that afford a number of advantages for increased backup performance, but also immutable backups. For those deployments that have smaller locations, potentially branch offices, or even just small software-only deployments, we do have the opportunity for ShadowSafe, which is the SLA-based data protection. This is the ability to provide the same data protection services, but in a software-only format, and we work with third-party storage. So cloud services is really StorageCraft's opportunity to provide you as an administrator a DR as a service. Right? This is the opportunity to replicate data protection that's happening locally on premises into our cloud. And when I say DR as a service, this is the full data network, and application recovery of any physical or virtual server that's protected on premises, where you can actually run that and resume those applications in our cloud. And that way, that'll get you up and running much faster, obviously, from a site disaster, but you can provide network connectivity back to your users on premises. And so cloud service is an opportunity to overlay and extend your ability to recover from a different fault or error that's happened either locally, that could be minor, it could be more of a site failure and a full disaster recovery, but both options with OneSafe and ShadowSafe have the opportunity to provide that. We also go to third-party clouds like AWS, but the one thing that really underpins what StorageCraft has been investing in is our converged architecture for combining storage and data protection. And we do this because we've architected a unique scale-out architecture in that we don't use a traditional RAID or LUN-based storage approach. We don't do the typical block store that myself and everybody here on the call has been using for the last 20, 30 years, where you're actually creating fixed blocks and you're writing ones and zeros to different LUNs and volumes on a certain number of disk drives and presenting information, whether it be block or file access to applications or databases. That's worked for a long time. However, it's not going to work going forward based upon the changing needs of what you as admin need to do. So what we've done is we've actually architected OneSafe and written our own distributed object store. This is different than a traditional block store. There are no LUNs and volumes to worry about. Object storage, for those that aren't familiar with it, is the same technology that Amazon S3 and GCP and others use for their massive cloud scale storage. It affords a lot of opportunities. However, it oftentimes requires RESTful APIs for an integration, or S3 APIs in Amazon's case, right? Which is another variant of a RESTful API. What we've done is OneSafe is a distributed object store, and you can start with a single node and just the storage capacity you need, and that can actually provide file system services, NFS and SMB, to your applications, VMware as well as just other applications and other file serving needs. So we look like scale out network attached storage, but underneath the covers, we have a distributed object store. And I'll get into some of those benefits about the immutability in a minute, but you'll see there on the right-hand side of the yellow box, the data protection, right? So on the top half of this, we run different microservices, file system services, also data protection services that are integrated with the cluster. And that affords a lot of opportunities so that when files and content is being backed up to a OneSafe cluster, we're actually decomposing those files and that information, segmenting it, doing deduplication, compression, and then converting that into an object which can be moved to any drive in the cluster as necessary. And that affords a lot of opportunity for growth and scaling out, where you don't have to change the application connectivity or configuration as you grow from 50 terabytes to 100 terabytes to 300 terabytes, right? So that's actually something that's very unique to StorageCraft. In addition to how, and we are delivering the software that I just described here at a high level, in a little bit more detail, the same software runs on multiple OneSafe models. Our ability to provide inline deduplication and compression for data reduction, but also our ability to provide continuous data protection. And when I say continuous data protection, that is, we're taking snapshots of unstructured data. So file systems that are writing to us and the information stored in a OneSafe cluster, we're taking snapshots every 90 seconds. And so as you look at this, and you look at the security of how you're going to protect that information, one way is through recovery of snapshots. And I'll get into, and I'll show you in a live demonstration how that's done. It's very straightforward. Point and click and you're done, as well as the ability to provide encryption at rest. I mentioned before that we don't do any RAID or LUN-based storage management. Everything is object-based. So you get, as an administrator, all the benefits of object storage. You can now just think about a pool of storage. You don't have to worry about how much storage you're going to allocate to a given application. You just have the entire capacity of the cluster available for any application that needs it, or any data protection services that need it at any point in time. From a DR perspective, you have the opportunity for replication to other locations, but also to our cloud services that I mentioned. So you can replicate to another OneSafe cluster or to our cloud, or you can replicate your backups to third-party clouds as well. From a fault domain perspective, This is one of the things that, again, affords you the opportunity to, based upon your deployment and your requirements, you can protect against fault domains differently, whether it be from a one-click business continuity resumption in our cloud, or recovering a share in a remote location from a OneXafe cluster can be done in 3 mouse clicks. But in all these cases, whether you're looking at fault domain and how we recover much faster than even a failed drive in a RAID set, we don't pay that penalty, right? We actually can rebuild large 12 terabyte drives in a matter of hours and not weeks. And as you grow and scale it over time, our architecture is such that you have that capacity, that resiliency that's going to be there, regardless of if it's a 3-node cluster or a 5-node cluster or a 7-node cluster of multiple petabytes, right? In all those cases, the dynamic object placement that our distributed object store affords you as an administrator is very flexible in that you don't have to do anything, even in the event of a disk drive failure. You don't have to replace it, and we will rebuild that information and those objects that were written to that disk drive. So before I move on, well, let me talk about one other thing, and there have been a couple questions that have come in, and I'll get to them in just a second after this slide here. So the software that I've been describing about with our object store and the benefits of data reduction and protection, that actually runs across our entire product family. So unlike other storage vendors that have different hardware platforms, and you can have some features on some models but not on others, with us you can actually run the same software on all 3 models here that you see. The 2 left models are hard drive based models. So there's a 12-bay model, which is the 4412, 17-bay model, which is the 4417 in the middle, and those afford different capacities, and each of them support up to 12 terabyte drives, and so you can start with a single node and a handful of terabytes, or fully populate with 144 terabytes, and then obviously scaling multiple nodes in the cluster can increase the cluster capacity to just over, a little less than 1.5 petabytes if you're looking at the 4417 model. So depending upon that and your fault domain protection of single drive or dual drive protection, your usable capacity will obviously be less than the raw capacity. But depending upon your needs of capacity or performance, you have the opportunity to look at the 5410. This is our all-flash solution, and you can use up to 3.8 terabyte SSDs, and you can have, again, 7 nodes in a cluster. So depending upon your requirements, you can have over 250 terabytes in a single all-flash cluster. The price points and the attractiveness of what we've done really affords customers the opportunity to deploy these in different ways. So when you look at the all-flash, it's more affordable than I think most people think, as well as it changes that decision criteria about where I can and cannot use all-flash based on my budget. So you're looking at, for a 38 terabyte flash solution, list price is about $40,000. That's before, obviously, any data reduction and so forth for the increased usable capacity. The all-flash solution is at that price point, which I mentioned, but the other thing that's attractive is the hard drive-based solution. If you look at the 4412 and 4417 model, it actually works out to be less expensive than the Amazon S3 rental pricing. So keeping that in mind in terms of different deployment options. So a couple questions. There's a question here about OneXafe supporting VMware, or does it support other hypervisors? So from a storage perspective, OneXafe supports VMware today. From a data protection standpoint, we do support other hypervisors. So you can protect VMs running in Hyper-V, as well as VMware, as well as physical servers. So from a primary storage, where we're the NFS data store, as opposed to the VHD and Hyper-V, we do support VMware from a VHD and OneXafe storage. We don't support Hyper-V yet. There's another question here about supporting hyper-converged infrastructure. So it depends upon how you define hyper-converged infrastructure. We do from the perspective of you can run storage services, or scale storage services, as well as data protection services on the cluster. And we do that inherently, and I'll show you that happening in one system in just a moment. What we don't offer is the ability to run general purpose applications on our cluster, like a Nutanix or something like that, or where you have a hyper-converged server and storage infrastructure, okay? There's a question here. I'm going to hold off on the question on ShadowSafe for just a moment, because that'll come up. I want to talk about one other thing before I address that question, but I'll come back to that. So I want to talk about one other thing before we get into the demo. So I want to set the stage with 3 different use cases, and this is all about recovery of how do you get your information back in the event of downtime, right? And so we'll talk about the SLA-driven data protection, and then also the primary storage for virtual servers, as well as what we do for unstructured data. So with that, let me transition here to another polling question, and just get everybody's pulse about how confident are you in your ability to store and protect data, particularly around protection against ransomware. So please only choose one question here. I should say not one question, one answer to this, right? Ranging from very confident, you bet a year's salary, all the way to kind of middle of the road, hey, I'm kind of comfortable, I'd bet a month's salary, or I have my fingers and toes crossed, right? And that's kind of the hope it doesn't happen to me strategy. So we'll give everybody a bit of time here to answer as that's coming through. Okay. Seeing a good portion of people being comfortable right now. A few are very confident. Good news is that nobody has their fingers and toes crossed yet. Doesn't mean you can't, but you know, if you're at that point, you have room for improvement, certainly. Okay, we've got some semi-comfortable. Okay, let's wait just another moment here. Okay, so pretty even mix. Fortunately, we do have a number of respondents here that are very confident in their strategy. A number that are pretty comfortable, so room for improvement, which is fine, and that's par for the course. Most organizations that we work with, they're not happy with their data protection and storage infrastructure. There's always room for improvement, right? So that's one of the things we can talk about here. So let's go to the next slide here, transition a little bit into the data protection side. One of the things that OneXafe offers here is the ability to provide agent as well as agent-based data protection. You'll see this here in the demonstration momentarily, where the ability to define service levels and policies to apply to a large number of virtual machines or physical servers is one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing, is making it easy as possible to create data protection policies, apply them to different servers so you know what's protected, you know where you're vulnerable and where you need to improve, but also the ability to recover that information in literally milliseconds. So those of you that are familiar with Shadow Protect, you may be familiar with VirtualBoot. That same recovery capability we've brought over and incorporated within OneXafe and ShadowSafe to really be able to provide the recovery for any size virtual machine in less than a second. But also the ability to do recovery to dissimilar hardware. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about VMware and Hyper-V integration. That's certainly there from the data protection standpoint. And this ties into one of the questions from the audience here in terms of, is ShadowSafe going to replace Shadow Protect? There are some other details here that this person was asking, so I'll take this on offline. But overall, ShadowSafe and Shadow Protect, Shadow Protect is not going away right now. ShadowSafe is really where, it's what we've recently introduced. It's where we now have the agentless protection for VMware. So that's one of the differences between ShadowSafe and Shadow Protect. But Shadow Protect is going to continue to be there for quite some time. And you'll see a lot of the capabilities actually for ShadowSafe that we've deployed leverage a lot of the agents that we have had over the years, for more than 10 years, with Shadow Protect for the physical, as well as if you're going to do an agent-based protection for a VM. So a lot of things that we've done there that we've carried over from Shadow Protect and now leveraging within ShadowSafe. So we'll follow up with the person that has a very specific question of their environment, and we can get into that. We'll follow up offline. So let me set the stage here in terms of different deployment options, right? So it's all about recovery, right? And it's all about what your risk mitigation strategy is for your organization. If you start and take a look on the left-hand side, this is where OneXafe is the primary storage, right? So your copy of the data that your users and the applications depend on is written to OneXafe. And that could be for a VMware environment. It could be for other physical servers. It could be for unstructured data, right? Depending upon your application and your environment, it could be to an all-flash, it could be to a hard drive-based cluster, right? The 44 series or the 5410 models. That's for the primary storage. If you look in the middle, this is where you can also take advantage of the converged data protection and storage, right? Where OneXafe is providing the SLA-based data protection services for VMware as well as other physical servers. And this is something that all of these cases, depending on how you're protecting it, you can remotely replicate to another OneXafe cluster on the right-hand side of the slide, or you can go into our cloud for full DR as a service, or third-party clouds like Amazon for just replicating the backups there. And then from there, you would actually pull the information back down from a recovery standpoint. But this is one of the things that the architecture that we've developed with OneXafe, it affords you to simply change the licensing or subscribe to other services. So if you start out, if you have an initial need for storage, you can start out with a OneXafe cluster to do that, but you can also add and change, and well, I shouldn't say change, you can add the data protection services at any point in time. And you have that same hardware that's leveraged for potentially both purposes, but now you're just subscribing and enabling other features for the same software. So it's very flexible in terms of how you can get into using OneXafe for a particular project or a portion of your environment, and then have that OneXafe support your growth and your changing needs over time. And when you look at remote replication, there are different options, as I mentioned, to another cluster or into StorageCraft's cloud as an example. But you can begin to do bidirectional replication. So we have a lot of customers that are doing multiple sites where they have engineers working in different locations, working on different CAD/CAM files, etc., where they can actually replicate a subset of the shares on a share-by-share basis. You can determine what you want to replicate to another cluster. You can also replicate to dissimilar clusters. Thinking again, removing the whole notion, that legacy thinking about RAID LUNs and volumes, you can actually think about this just as a pool of storage, right? And San Francisco is, if you can't tell from the icons there, that's an all-flash cluster, replicating to New York, which is a hard drive-based cluster. And so that's something that affords you a lot of flexibility to figure out, okay, do I have enough capacity in the cluster? You can replicate whatever you need to with different configurations, in many-to-many or one-to-many. Excuse me. There's a question here that came in about the pool storage and adding drives to the cluster in terms of, can you use off-the-shelf drives and do we update the firmware? So one of the things is notice on the earlier slide, we enable you to bring your own drives. So you can provide your own SSDs. There's a compatibility list of SSDs, but you can buy them at retail pricing just as you can buy hard drives at retail pricing and use them in OneXafe clusters. We don't reset any firmware. I mean, we work with almost every hard drive. I don't recommend like SMR drives or 5,400 RPM drives, but you can start with 4 terabyte drives and go up to 12 terabyte drives in the current models, and we'll work with those. So if you have Dell or EMC or HP drives from other systems and you'd like to reuse those, you can certainly do so. Okay. The other area here, from a backup recovery perspective, one of the things is how quickly can you get that information back? I mentioned that the same software runs on our different models. So depending upon your recovery requirements, you can actually back up to an all-flash cluster. And when you combine that with the ability to scale out over time, and as you need to add more storage, you don't have to reconfigure any of your backups. The same cluster looks available to your the data protection to OneXafe for protecting 20 VMs or 50 VMs. Those don't have to be reconfigured. That pool of storage simply increases. And when you combine that with the all-flash capability of OneXafe, you can now take advantage of recovering any size VM in literally less than a minute. So that's when the VM starts to boot up. And then depending upon the storage, the VM will be available in a couple minutes or tens of minutes, right? Depending upon your network, depending upon the I/O that's happening. But this is something that StorageCraft has a number of patents around, where the VM that you're recovering and you begin to boot in vCenter, the information is being read from OneXafe, the backup target. And let's just say it's all flash, right? Every time your application is going to read information, it's going to write new information to the storage or modify it, it begins to do that back to what it thinks is the primary storage, right? And so in reality, it's actually reading everything off of the OneXafe cluster as the recovery target and writing it, and we're recovering it back to the primary storage. And so throughout this process, and depending on how big the VM is, right, that process could take a few minutes, or if it's a large one, it could take an hour or two, depending upon the size, right? But in all those cases, that recovered VM looks like it's accessing the data from the primary storage. When it needs to, it pulls it from OneXafe. But if it's already written information in the primary storage, it'll just get it directly from the primary storage, which means now that at the end of that recovery process, there's no need to do a storage vMotion to get the recovered VM, that recovered data store, back to the primary storage. And I'll show this to you in the demo here in just literally 2 seconds. But this is actually one of the things that, depending upon your budget and depending upon the priority, you can actually use different clusters for different recovery purposes, right? And we have a lot of customers doing this where they'll take the critical 5 to 10 VMs in their environment and they'll back those up to an all-flash OneXafe cluster. And then they'll take the other 80% and they'll run those and back those up to a OneXafe cluster that's actually hard drive based, right? Because the capacity is more important than performance. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you can actually manage and recover that information. So let's transition now to the live demo. And I'm looking here just quickly in case any questions have come in. But let's transition here to the live demo and kind of show you a little bit about how one system can provide the data protection, but also the storage management capabilities. So this is one system. This is the dashboard. At a very high level, you get a glimpse of what's going on in your environment, right? This is the overall one system, which is healthy. It's communicating with your OneXafe, and everything is fine. If you're looking at the data protection services, these are the machines, both physical and virtual, that are being protected, or in this case, which ones are not being protected. So I can very quickly see which ones I need to take remediated, which ones I need to remediate in terms of my policy to assign and protect that information. You can also see over time what that protection status is. So after I assign a policy to a certain number of VMs, how successful are all those backups every 15 minutes or 30 minutes or hour, whatever I set, and what's that status look like. Overall capacity utilization, as well as change rates and throughput. So from a storage perspective, we've always focused on how do you make it as easy as possible to manage storage, right? Give you back as much time as possible. So when you create shares, this is one of the things that I mentioned, we look like scale at network attached storage. So from a recovery perspective for like home directories and map network drives or file serving, CAD CAM, et cetera, you can create shares here. I'm just going to create one, Sean D, and we'll just assign this to a given cluster. It doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to leave it open. Now, if I can also register with Active Directory, and you can manage all of your permissions through Windows as you're used to at the share file folder level that you'd like to. So depending upon the share that I'm going to be creating and the purpose, I can define a different storage policy for that. So if it's a virtual server or if it's for backup recovery, I'm going to have inline variable length dedupe. I'm going to have compression enabled. I'm also going to have snapshots enabled. Remember that these snapshots are immutable, and so if something happens to my backup file, I can go back to a different point in time for that snapshot and get back the information that was there before anything was compromised. Or I can do custom, and this is what I was mentioning in terms of defining and those snapshot retention period. So we're taking snapshots every 90 seconds, keeping those for the first hour, and then hourly for the first day, daily for the first week, and weekly forever. So you as an administrator, you don't have to worry about setting up a different LUN for storage capacity of your snapshots. All the snapshots are deduplicated against the primary data and the primary objects. So depending upon change rate, it's only going to be a little bit of an overhead. But the good news is that you don't have to worry about how much storage is used for each. You're just thinking about a pool of storage. Now, when you delete data, the snapshots are going to preserve those objects for the retention period that you define, 3 months or a year, right, or 7 years or forever. So if I delete a terabyte of data and I have snapshots on for a year, you're obviously not going to get back any of that capacity until a year later, and those snapshots expire. But this is something that very easily, in a couple of clicks, I'm creating a share, right? And so now I'm done. So that's as easy as it is to create a share. And when you're going and thinking about how am I going to protect this share, right? How am I going to replicate this to another cluster? You can do that easily as well. But before I get into the remote replication, well, let me actually do the remote replication first, and then I'll get into the data protection policies. So when you're looking to recover information from another cluster, you can very easily, in 3 mouse clicks, replicate that to another cluster. So I have my replication target, which is saying this share is resident on this cluster, and I'm going to choose the other one, right? So and if I have multiple clusters, you're going to have multiple options for destination. So I'm going to click next here. And if I'm on the same network, I don't have to worry about any firewall ports or external IP addresses, and I just click next and I'm done. So literally, in those 3 mouse clicks, you've just replicated a share. And if you want to select multiple shares, you can do that at the same time. And those of you that have been managing storage for some time, you know that you don't have to worry about having the same one configuration or any of that burdensome overhead of that makes it difficult to protect information off-site. You can actually do so just thinking about a pool of storage, right? Now, transitioning here to the data protection side, this is where I can define my policies. And you can see I already have a number of policies set up in my environment where I have a high priority is protected my most important machine, and it's taking snapshots every 15 minutes for 10 days. And I've got recovery points daily, weekly, and monthly. And here I have an icon about how is that protection flow. It's protected locally to OneSafe, but it's also replicated to 2 different places. It's replicated to another storage, in this case OneSafe, as well as into StorageCraft's cloud for DR as a service. And you can decide how you want to protect that information and define different policies, medium and low, and protect different machines with different retention periods and different destinations, right? It's very easy to do, as well as if I want to change this. So let's say my agent policy, I want to modify this. I can modify this policy in just a couple of clicks. So let's say I want to actually have 14 4-hour recovery points. I want to keep it for 3 weeks, right? I can do that and click Save. If I want to replicate that now, I can choose my destination. And then you can decide this. I'm not going to change my replication strategy. I'm just going to change the retention period and my recovery points. So now I click Save. Now, if I had done this on my low priority policy, that would automatically change that policy to all 281 machines in that same workflow. So very straightforward to do and very easy to apply to different VMs. So now I'm going to come into my different view for the protection. So which VMs and which physical servers is one system protecting with our data protection policies. So this is where you have a long list of everything, but you can also very quickly find and search for which ones. In this case, I'm going to look for all my CentOS systems. Now I see those, and I can choose which ones I'd like to protect, and you can assign a policy to those very easily. And so when you click on this assign policy, I now have that same thumbnail view where I see at a very high level what my agent policy is. Because I don't have to try to remember what was my low priority, what was my agent-based policy. I can see what those recovery points are and what that flow is, and I can choose which ones I'd like to change and apply to those particular VMs. I'm not going to change that, but I just want to show everybody how easy it was to do that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here to the dashboard. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is the view where you actually see which machines are unprotected. These are machines that people may have added that I didn't know about or something else happened. You can set up policies that will automatically apply a data protection policy to any VM that's added to a virtual server. But if you don't, you can now very easily see, I'm going to protect these now. I'm going to see these 9 systems, physical and or virtual, in this case they're all virtual, don't have a protection policy assigned to them. So this is where I can very easily just say, okay, I can select all these, and let's just do the default, right? And you can, or you can actually go and choose individual ones and choose a different policy, right? And that's one of the things you can easily do. I'm going to go ahead and back out of this and show the recovery, right? So one of the things is how quickly can you get information back in the event of recovery? We talked a little about the DR as a service. I'm going to focus just on the local recovery at this point, but I'll show you where you could do that if you wanted to. So again, I'm going to come through and I'm just going to search for my CentOS. And I'm just going to pick any of these. It doesn't matter which one. Now from here, I now have different recovery points, right? And these are the different recovery points based upon that policy that I assigned to protect this VM. The default is going to be recover from optimal, and that's going to be the most recent snapshot from the storage that's closest to the virtual server. I can also choose a different destination. If I want to recover that from my DR target, if I know something happened locally to my storage, I can go to my DR target, but you can choose, I'm going to leave this as optimal for now. And I'm going to choose this recovery point. Now, if you want to do a file level recovery, you can do that granular recovery by going through this workflow. I'm going to do the system recovery to show you the virtual boot, right? So this is going to create a new VM on the virtual server, and it'll be this name here, and we append it with recovery so you can very easily see which VM was recovered. And I can determine which vCenter I want to go with, as well as the host ID and what data store I want it to use. I'm just going to choose local storage for now. If you want to adjust the CPU and memory, you can, as well as if you want to define a different network adapter, you can do that. And now I just click next, and that's going to recover and give you a quick summary before I hit recover. This is going to recover the VM from that point in time to the virtual server, and then in vCenter, you will actually see that booting up in literally less than a second. Once that's booted up, your application is off and running, and we will recover and move the data in the background from the OneXafe target to the primary data store. Or if this is a shadow safe only software deployment from third-party storage, we'll recover that from third-party storage back to the primary data store. Now, in this case, I'm actually not going to go through the recovery process, but I did want to show everybody the quick workflow about what that looked like. So let's flip back. I'm going to switch back to the slides now. A couple other things to discuss. I'm also going to check to see if we have any more questions that have come in from that, because I couldn't see the questions as I was doing the demonstration. So, yeah, so actually there's a question here about if you have two offices, can you have one cluster in each? And so yes, or it'd be recommended to have a third. No, you can actually do that with two locations. If you have two locations, and even if you have servers in both locations, you can protect those servers to the local OneXafe clusters in each of those two locations, and you can do a bi-directional replication, right? So ESXi-A, for backing up locally, that can be replicated to the second location, and ESXi-B being protected in the second location, replicated back to the primary. You can do that absolutely, and then in each case, you have a read-write share in the primary location, replicating to a read-only share in the remote location. And then you're protected in both cases. And again, the only thing you need to worry about is your pool of storage large enough to do that bi-directional replication. And you don't have to replicate all the shares. You can determine which ones you'd like to. So I just want to touch briefly on the virtual server side for VMware. We talked about the data protection. If you wanted to use OneXafe for VMware, you could do that as well. This is the opportunity where you can use our all-flash for VMware. Now, we're not going to be the fastest in the industry. We're not going to be as fast as like a Pure Storage, right? However, if you're in the 20 to 30,000 IOPS range for 4K and 7030, and you're looking at affordable all-flash that delivers great performance with these features that we just discussed, it's certainly something that OneXafe can do. But the advantage of our object architecture is you don't have to worry about how many LUNs you're going to assign to a given data store, right? A single NFS data store can be as large as VMware supports, which is 64 terabytes a day. From there, you can assign and allocate as many VMDKs to that data store as you'd like to. There's no file size limit on a given VM. So if you have an application that's writing multiple terabyte sized files, that's not a problem because we're an object store, right? If you want to fully utilize all 64 terabytes from that data store, you can do so as well. As you grow over time from 10 to 100 to 300 terabytes, you don't have to change anything. The data store just sees more storage. So if you initially start with 10 terabytes and you grow to 100, your data store just seamlessly increased to 64 terabytes. No thin provisioning, no migration, no application reconfiguration, The same is true as we look at the unstructured data side, right? And this is where we have customers that are using us for medical imaging, file serving, archiving, digital asset management, CAD/CAM, the list goes on, right? Where you don't have to now have a data protection policy for VM running in VMware. You don't have to run Windows servers as a VM in your hypervisor. You can actually just run everything directly off of our cluster. And with the same software, you have the same deduplication and compression benefits and the same data protection in terms of snapshots every 90 seconds. But particularly from a recovery standpoint and a ransomware prevention standpoint, this is one of the things that a lot of our customers, unfortunately, have been infected with ransomware, but they've been able to recover everything, including backups. There's a large hotel in New York that is using us for VDI. They were using Nimble storage for hosting the VMs for all the app and the boot images, and they were using OneXafe for the file serving for all their VDI environment. They were also using that same OneXafe cluster for their Veeam backups. And this is one of the advantages of OneXafe is the multiple purposes. You can have backup being written to a OneXafe cluster as well as the primary storage. Unfortunately, they were infected with ransomware and everything was encrypted. Now, in this case, we're not going to prevent ransomware. You have to have that perimeter defense. You have to have that AV strategy to prevent that. But if something does happen, we are going to write out all the encrypted files to the cluster. We can't stop that. However, because everything is immutable, everything is, the original content is still there, right? And so this hotel was able to go back and recover literally their entire business from snapshots that we had enabled, but all the Nimble snapshots were compromised, right? At the same time, this is something that you can enable your users to just do, right mouse, Windows previous version, if it's just an accidental deletion. But if this is a ransomware protection, this is one of the things that you can actually go through as an administrator. You can recover, an entire mapped network drive or individual files or folders or an entire share. And you can literally go back in point in time every 90 seconds if it's being updated, that if your file system is being updated that frequently, go back, just navigate to the time at which you don't have the corrupted files written to the cluster, and you can pull those out and recover them. So it's something that's very affordable and very easy to use. In terms of when I say affordable, it affords you other opportunities to recover from snapshots where the data is written to OneXafe as the primary, but if these were backups of your VMs or other physical servers, those same backup files are protected via snapshots as well. So you have immutable backups as well as the immutable primary storage. A couple questions came in here for the remote replication. How can a share be recovered with remote replication? Good question. So let me actually, the same 3 clicks that I showed, well, let me go back here. We have just a couple minutes here. So I'm going to flip back to the recovery to show this person that was asking about the recovery. So within OneXafe, this is where you can look at the shares again, and you can actually do some of the same searching in terms of what we were doing before for CentOS. So these are the 2 shares that I had created. And now you can see that this one is being replicated from cluster F877. And you can see that it's a target, and here's my RPO, right? That's the last point in time that the file system is synced for that share. So if I'm going to recover this, I can do so in 3 clicks, and it'll be as of that recovery point. So from this, I have to select the share. Now I can promote this from read-only to read-write. And now in 2 clicks, I'm done, okay? Now, this is actually one of the protection mechanisms. Anytime you're going to promote a share from read-only to read-write, it's going to be as of that last point in time. So that recovery point may not be current, so there'll be, there'll be as of that last point in time. Anytime you're going to delete a share, you need to actually enter the password to confirm that, right? It's possible data loss. You're going to lose as much information back to the last RPO. So now that's it. You just recovered that and promoted that read-only share to read-write. And now it's syncing. And this now is available immediately for access by your application. And now you'll notice that this is actually going to transition and reverse the replication from the target back to the primary. So let's go here. We had one other question before we wrap up here that came in. When adding one additional OneXafe to a cluster, is there downtime involved? So there actually is not downtime when you're scaling out. This is actually one of the things that when you're adding multiple OneXafe to a cluster, you can actually just plug in the network power and drives and turn it on. The OneXafe that you're adding to the network will automatically discover the other OneXafe on the network, and you can actually just literally in 2 clicks add to the OneXafe to the cluster that's already established and just click join and you're done. And then we will actually redistribute objects as necessary among all the drives in the cluster. Again, thinking about fault domain protection, giving you the ability to recover in the event of a drive failure, a node failure in a cluster. If you lose an entire node in a multi-node cluster, it could be 17 drives in a single node. You can lose that entire node and your information will be protected, right? So we'll redistribute those objects in the background, thinking about fault domain protection, and you're off and running. Your applications don't know that anything has changed. They simply see more storage capacity. Or your users with their map network drive, they simply see more storage available. Now you can set share level quotas if you'd like to, but you don't have to. But that's as easy as it is to add an additional cluster, add additional node to a cluster with no downtime. So with that, I think I've got through all those questions, and there was that one detailed question on Shadow Protect. I'll follow up with that person afterwards. But David, let me turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Sean, for covering those questions. And a reminder to everyone, if we didn't get to your question, we'll follow up with you when we're done. So I want to remind everyone, we do have the Continuity Deal bundle available for download. So look at that in the handouts. We've got the OneSafe Asset Library there as well. So take a look at that. All right, well, I want to thank you, Sean, for your presentation today and the live demo, and special thanks to StorageCraft for sponsoring this great event today. This will be available on demand. Look for that link to come in to your inbox in about a day. So thank you, everyone, for attending today. We look forward to another partner webinar soon. So until then, take care all.